She was 34 years old and standing in the mud outside a courthouse that no longer had any use for her name. Her husband's brother had seen to that, calling in a debt that was never truly his to pay, and the town of Millhaven Crossing watched without a word as the sheriff nailed a notice to the door of the only home she had ever built with her own two hands. What she had left fit into a single canvas satchel and a coin purse holding $41, the sum total of a life savings scraped from selling milk and mending shirts. With that money, against the advice of every soul who still spoke to her, she walked 3 miles out past a frozen bend of the Cedar River and paid $11 for an abandoned ice house that the whole valley had written off as a pile of rotting timber and old sawdust, a place so forgotten that even the crows had stopped roosting on its roof. They laughed at her in the mercantile the next morning, said she bought herself a tomb of ice and splinters. They did not know that beneath the frozen floor of that ice house lay something sealed away 11 winters past, something that would not only restore everything she had lost, but would answer a question the entire town of Millhaven Crossing had been too afraid to ask for over a decade. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Voss. If you're watching from a place that feels forgotten, left out in the cold by people who should have known your worth, tell us in the comments, because this story was written for you. Eleanor Voss had not been born to hardship. She had been born to Thomas and Margaret Ashworth in the spring of 1858 in a modest farmhouse outside Millhaven Crossing, Kansas, a town young enough then that its church still smelled of fresh-cut pine. Her father was a cooper by trade, a man of quiet patience who spent his days coaxing barrels and buckets out of white oak staves, and it was from him that Eleanor learned the first and most enduring lesson of her life, that nothing in this world was truly worthless until you had turned it over in your hands and looked at it properly. He would take broken barrel hoops that other coopers threw into the scrap pile and reforge them into hinges, latches, even toys for the children who wandered by his workshop. Everybody's throwing something away, Ellie, he used to tell her, tapping a bent nail against his palm. The trick is being the one who bothers to pick it up. Her mother, for her part, taught her patience of a different kind. The patience of the kitchen garden, of watching seeds that seemed dead in the frost of April become green and stubborn by June. Margaret Ashworth had a gift for preserving things, for pickling and canning and packing root cellars so full that even in the leanest years the family never went hungry, and she passed this gift to her daughter along with a simpler philosophy. That cold, properly used, was not an enemy but a friend, a means of keeping good things good until their season came round again. It was this second lesson that would matter most, though Eleanor could not have known it as a girl. She grew up watching the ice-cutting crews come every January to haul great blocks from the frozen surface of the Cedar River, packing them in sawdust inside the ice houses that dotted the valley, so that come July there might be a sliver of relief from a brutal Kansas summer. She loved the ritual of it, loved watching the men with their long saws and iron tongs, the way the ice groaned and split like something alive being born out of the river's dark water. She married young, at 19, to a gentle, hard-working man named Peter Voss, a wheelwright with a limp from a childhood fever and eyes the color of creek water, and together they built a small but sturdy life on a parcel of land at the edge of town. They had no children, a sorrow they carried together without ever letting it curdle into bitterness between them, and instead poured their care into their trade, into their neighbors, into the modest home Peter built board by board with his own hands. Eleanor kept the books for his wheelwright shop, learned to read a ledger the way her father had taught her to read a piece of scrap wood, always searching for the value hidden in what looked, at first glance, like nothing at all. It was Peter's older brother, Silas Voss, who would in time become the architect of Eleanor's ruin, though in those early years he seemed only a minor irritation, a man who drifted from scheme to scheme with the restless hunger of someone who believed the world owed him more than it had given. Silas had left Millhaven Crossing as a young man to chase silver in the Colorado hills and had come back a decade later with nothing to show for it but debts, a hard mouth, and a simmering resentment toward his younger brother, who had stayed behind and, through steady unglamorous work, built something that actually endured. When Peter died of a fever in the winter of 1889, quietly and without much warning, it was Silas who came to the funeral dressed in a borrowed black coat, offering condolences that Eleanor, in her grief, did not yet recognize as calculations. She did not know then that her husband, in a moment of brotherly softness some years before, had co-signed a note for Silas's failed mining venture, a debt that had gone unpaid and quietly accrued interest in a Topeka bank ledger, waiting like a trap sprung shut the moment its co-signer was in the ground, and his widow was too grief-stricken to notice the paperwork crossing her table. The full, When it came slowly and then all at once, the way a barn roof holds through years of small rot before it finally gives way in a single afternoon. For 2 years after Peter's death, Eleanor kept the wheelwright shop running with the help of an aging journeyman named Cyrus Pratt, and she managed, through sheer stubbornness, to keep the household afloat. But Silas Voss had never stopped watching, and when the Topeka Bank finally called him the note, he saw an opportunity dressed as misfortune. He arrived in Millhaven Crossing with papers Eleanor barely understood, papers that named her as Peter's widow and inheritor of his estate, responsible for a debt she had never known existed. She fought it as best she could, walked the dusty road to the county courthouse more times than she could count, sat across from lawyers who spoke a language designed to be impenetrable to a woman without formal schooling. But the debt was real, the signature on the note was Peter's own hand, and in the end the law, indifferent as weather, sided with the paper over the person. The wheelwright shop was sold to cover the note. The house Peter had built board by board went with it. Silas, for his part, made a great show of sorrow at the proceedings, even offered Eleanor a few dollars for the road, which he refused with a look that made the county clerk glance away in second-hand embarrassment. The town watched all of this the way towns watch such things, with murmured sympathy that cost nothing and did nothing, and within a season Eleanor Voss had gone from a respected shopkeeper's widow to a woman standing outside a courthouse with a satchel and a coin purse, exactly as we found her in the beginning of this story. It was old Cyrus Pratt, the journeyman who had stayed loyal to her through the whole deal, who first mentioned the Icehouse. He had worked ice crews as a younger man and remembered the old Larkspur Icehouse out past the Cedar River Bend, a squat timber and stone structure built some 15 years earlier by a group of investors who had gone bankrupt before it ever saw a full season of use, its ownership tangled in some old dispute that had left it sitting empty and untaxed for over a decade. "Nobody wants it, Ellie," Cyrus told her, not unkindly, "on account of nobody remembers who even owns the deed anymore. County's been trying to auction it off for years just to clear the paperwork." Eleanor walked out to see it that same afternoon, her boots sinking into the thawing March mud, and found a building that time had tried and failed to erase, its roof sagging but intact, its double walls, built with a foot of sawdust insulation between them just as her father had once described to her, still holding some ghost of their old purpose. Something in her, some stubborn ember passed down from a cooper who never threw anything away, refused to see it as ruin. She went to the county clerk's office the following morning, and for $11, nearly a quarter of everything she had left in this world, she purchased the abandoned Larkspur Icehouse and the half-acre of frozen, weed-choked ground it stood upon. The laughter followed her out of the courthouse and into the mercantile, where Hiram Foss, who ran the general store and fancied himself the town's unofficial oracle, told her flatly that she'd thrown good money after a rotting shed. "Ice business died with the railroad bringing in the mechanical coolers, Mrs. Voss," he said, not unkindly, but with a particular condescension and reserve for women they believe have lost their good sense. "You'd have done better burning that $11 for warmth." Eleanor said nothing in reply, only nodded and bought a lantern, a hatchet, and a sack of nails, and walked the 3 miles back out to her new and ridiculous inheritance with the setting sun at her back. She spent that first week simply clearing the place, hauling out rotted sawdust and broken crates, patching the roof where she could reach it, and it was on the 4th day, while prying up a section of the old plank flooring that had buckled and split from years of freeze and thaw, that she found the first clue, a rusted iron ring, half buried in packed earth, clearly meant to be a handle, clearly meant to open something that had been built to stay hidden. She worked at it for the better part of an hour before the section of flooring gave way, revealing not simply a gap beneath the boards but a proper cellar, dug deep and lined with fieldstone, cool and dry despite its years of neglect, the kind of construction that spoke of real money and real intention rather than the slapdash work of men in a hurry. It was, she would later understand, not merely a root cellar but a second, hidden ice chamber, built beneath the main icehouse floor and insulated so cleverly with layered straw and stone that whatever had been placed there had likely stayed cold and preserved for years without anyone the wiser. Her lantern light found, first, a row of ceramic crock sealed with wax, then a strong box of blackened iron, and finally, tucked into a stone alcove of the chamber's rear, a leather satchel gone stiff with age but otherwise remarkably intact, its buckles rusted shut, its surface stamped faintly with initials she did not yet recognize, ETL. It took her 3 days of careful work with vinegar and patience to open the strong backs, and when she finally did, her hands trembled at what she found inside. Not gold, not silver, but paper, deeds, ledgers, and a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon that had long since lost its color. The deeds were the first revelation. They belonged not to the men who had originally built the Icehouse and gone bankrupt, but to an earlier owner entirely, a man named Elias Thaddeus Larkspur, the very founder for whom the old ice company had apparently been named, though the town's living memory of him had faded into little more than a street sign and a half-remembered rumor. The ledgers, painstaking and precise, recorded not an ice business at all, but something far larger, records of land purchases across the entire valley, dating back to the years just after the Civil War, when Elias Larkspur had apparently made a quiet fortune buying up war bonds and government land scrip at pennies on the dollar from desperate veterans and widows, and had used that fortune to secretly acquire mineral and water rights beneath half of what was now Millhaven Crossing and the farmland surrounding it, all while presenting himself publicly as nothing more than a modest ice merchant. The letters told the rest of the story, and it was here that Eleanor's understanding of the town she had lived in her entire life began to crack and reshape itself into something far stranger and sadder than she had imagined. Elias Larkspur, it emerged, had been a man wrestling with his own conscience even as he built his hidden empire, and in his later letters, addressed to a lawyer in Topeka named Josiah Reams, he had begun making arrangements to undo what he had done, to quietly return the mineral and water rights to the descendants of the very families he had bought them from, ashamed, in his final years, of the deception that had built his fortune. He had died suddenly in the winter of 1875, before those arrangements could be finalized, and his estate, including the Icehouse where he had chosen to hide the true records of his dealings, trusting the cold and the isolation to keep them safe until the right person found them, had fallen into legal limbo, eventually swallowed by the same bureaucratic indifference that had left the building empty and forgotten for 15 years. Eleanor sat in that cold stone chamber long into the evening, reading by lantern light, and understood with a growing, breathless clarity that she was holding, in her two hands, the true and rightful deeds to nearly a third of the valuable land and mineral rights beneath Millhaven Crossing, land that dozens of families, including her own late husband's, had been paying rent or royalties on for over a decade to men who, she now realized with a cold shock, had never legitimately owned it at all. Word travels fast in a small town, and word of Eleanor Voss's strange discovery at the old Larkspur Icehouse traveled faster than most. It was Hiram Voss, ironically, who first noticed the changes in her, the new confidence in her step, the way she began quietly asking questions of the county clerk's office about old deed filings, and it was Hiram's loose tongue in the mercantile that eventually carried word back to the man who had the most to lose from Eleanor's discovery, Silas Voss himself, who had, in the 2 years since ruining his brother's widow, used his ill-gotten gains to buy himself a modest position on the town's land commission, a position that had allowed him to quietly profit from exactly the kind of disputed mineral rights that Elias Larkspur's ledgers now threatened to expose. Silas came to the Icehouse himself on a gray April afternoon, his borrowed authority draped over him like the black coat he'd worn to his brother's funeral, and told Eleanor plainly that whatever she thought she had found meant nothing without a court to recognize it, and that a woman alone, with no money and no lawyer, would find that court a very cold and unfriendly place. "You ought to leave well enough alone, Ellie," he told her, his voice pitched somewhere between warning and threat. "Some doors are better left shut." Eleanor, standing in the doorway of the Icehouse that everyone had mocked her for buying, looked at her brother-in-law with a steadiness that surprised even her and told him that she had spent 2 years watching people decide her woe for her, and she did not intend to spend a third. The conflict that followed consumed the better part of that spring and summer, and it tested every ounce of the patience Eleanor had inherited from her mother and every ounce of the stubbornness she had inherited from her father. Silas used what influence he had on the land commission to delay her filings, to question the authenticity of documents that were, in truth, entirely genuine, and to spread quiet doubt through the town about whether the widow Voss had perhaps forged the whole affair out of bitterness and desperation. Eleanor countered not with anger but with method, traveling to Topeka on money borrowed against the promise of the Strongback's contents, tracking down the aging lawyer, Josiah Reams, whose name appeared throughout Larkspur's letters, and finding him, remarkably, still alive, still practicing law in a modest office, and still in possession of his own copies of the original correspondence, which corroborated every claim the ledgers made. It was Reams who explained to her, with the weary satisfaction of a man finally closing a chapter he had long assumed unfinished, that Elias Larkspur had in fact drafted a formal instrument of restitution before his death, one that had never been properly filed due to confusion following his sudden passing, but which was entirely valid under Kansas law provided the original documents could be produced and authenticated, documents that had been sitting, forgotten, and preserved by the very cold Larkspur had intended, in the hidden chamber beneath the Icehouse floor for 15 years, waiting for someone patient enough and humble enough to go looking. The reckoning, when it finally came, arrived not through violence or scandal, but through the plain, unglamorous machinery of law that Silas Voss had once used against his brother's widow and now found turned against himself. With Josiah Reams's testimony and the authenticated ledgers in hand, Eleanor filed a formal claim with the district court in the autumn of 1892, and the case, once it became clear the documents were genuine, moved with surprising speed. The kind of speed that comes when a great many respectable men suddenly realize their own quiet profits are built on land they never legally held. The court recognized Elias Larkspur's original instrument of restitution, and with it, recognized Eleanor Voss as a finder and rightful executor of his final wishes, as a legal steward of the mineral and water rights he had intended to return. But Eleanor did not use this newfound power, as she might easily have, to enrich herself at the town's expense the way others had enriched themselves at Hayes. Instead, working alongside Reams and a newly humbled land commission that no longer counted Silas Voss among its members, she began the long, careful process of returning those rights to the very families whose ancestors had been quietly dispossessed of them a generation earlier, including, without a trace of bitterness, a small parcel that rightfully belonged to Cyrus Pratt's family, and another that restored to the widow of a farmer named Elmer Duckett a portion of grazing land his family had unknowingly been paying royalties on for years. Silas Voss's fall was quiet, as these things sometimes mercifully are, though no less complete for its quietness. Stripped of his commission seat and facing his own creditors once the true source of his recent prosperity came under scrutiny, he left Millhaven Crossing within the year, and the town, this time, did not watch his departure with sympathy. Eleanor herself kept only what was fair and legally hers as steward of the estate, enough to properly restore the old Icehouse and, in time, to rebuild a version of the wheelwright shop that had once been Hayes and Peters, though she gave most of her energy instead to something new, a small office in town where she helped other widows and forgotten families understand the deeds and papers that too often decided their fate without their understanding. She kept the Icehouse, too, restored and functioning again, not as a monument to what she had found there, but as a working part of the community once more. Its ice, come July, finding its way into the same kitchens and cellars that had once laughed at the $11 she paid for it. And so we return, as these stories always do, to where we began, to a woman standing outside a courthouse with a satchel and $41, watching a town decide, without asking her, what she was worth. Eleanor Voss did not find fortune in that frozen, forgotten Icehouse because fortune was owed to her, and she would tell you so herself, plainly, without false humility. She found it because she was the one person willing to walk 3 miles in the mud to look closely at something everyone else had already decided was worthless, because her father had taught her that nothing is truly ruined until someone stops bothering to turn it over in their hands, and because her mother had taught her that cold, patient, and unglamorous can preserve a good thing until its proper season finally comes round again. The secret beneath the ice was never really about land or ledgers or the fortune of a man named Elias Larkspur. It was about the simple, stubborn act of refusing to let other people's laughter decide the value of what you choose to save. Thank you for spending this time with Eleanor's story, and with us. If it moved you, we hope you'll consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear that being overlooked is not the same as being without worth. Before you go, we'd love to know, what is a time in your own life when you found real value in something, or someone, that the world around you had already written off? Tell us in the comment below. We read everyone, and your stories often become the seeds of the ones we tell next. Until next time, stay close.